But the real challenge is how do we get to the next level, which is us working together. The real challenge is how do we build a global governance system? How do we reinvent certain things that need to be reinvented? New institutions built with new principles. It's a little terrifying. It's real hard. In the next few years, this is going to be the struggle. However, if we solve it for Cardano, we solve it for every organization and government in the world. And you start realizing you don't need kings, you don't need presidents, you don't need CEOs, you don't need people at the top. We can do it right here at the bottom. That's a revolutionary idea, but at least America used to be in the business of revolutionary ideas. That's where we started from, sometimes too much. And so keeping up with my kinsmen and the history of my country, I'd like to add that idea to the pyre. But what's so cool about it, by definition, is self-determination means that it's as much your choice as it is mine. And you have to decide if that's as ambitious as we want to be, or maybe less so, or maybe more so. Who knows? Cardano's yours. And that's a good thing. So I hope these updates give you guys a little bit of view. Of course, I'll add some more after all the workshops are done. And again, we'll see you guys at Consensus and maybe some of you guys in Bermuda. And there's going to be a lot of real cool things this year. Got the Vossel hard fork in June, and then we have another one in October. A lot of real cool tech coming online. We see amazing progress in every single place you look, from TVL to DApp development. The numbers look phenomenal. Adoption, chain congestion's a good thing right now. People say we're a ghost chain. I often say it's a pretty constipated ghost then. And then obviously we get invited to all the big events and we get to meet all the people. Hard days, hard weeks, but we get through it. We do. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you guys soon. Cheers. Hi, everyone. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny. Sometimes Colorado. Today is March 7th, 2022, and I have a few updates for everybody. So this is a big week for the entire Cardano project. Whole Cardano Foundation executive leadership, senior management is here in Colorado, and we're having a lovely time in a series of seminars, workshops, and discussions about structuring a better open source project for Cardano. So as many of you know, Cardano's code is under an open source license. But the curation of it has been rather federated in nature. And we've gotten to a point where there are so many people in the community, so many projects in the community. There's, I think, more than 400 dApps that are being built right now. A lot of those biased towards the second half of the year after the Vossel hard fork. But in any event, there's tons of engineers floating around in many different companies, from DC Spark to Twig to Well-Typed, and obviously our company and the foundation itself. And so there's a big question about how does one structure all of that, put all those pieces together. And we've been working really closely with a lot of different people in the last 9 months to have those conversations. And we're starting to converge on a strategy that will be kind of built in layers. And these workshops are a pivotal component of that. So we'll give you guys an update on the back end of them, of all the things discussed and we've learned and commitments made, and hopefully maybe be able to get some timelines out about how new governance structures look like. But we've looked at a lot of different successful open source projects. For example, the Mozilla Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the Linux Foundation. And we've tried to really look at how they handle everything from how does one become a contributor? How do you measure merit of contributions? What type of standards processes need to be followed? For example, Ethereum has things like EIPs and ERCs. Well, analogously, we have CIPs, and we're talking about what a standards process would look like. We're also examining things like formal methods, how far down that stack we want to go. There's an IO viewpoint on how to do formal methods, and all of those specifications are public. And you can see that we've connected those to the code. But moving forward, should we move to more of a polyglot ecosystem, or maintain Haskell as the reference client and then still maintain the same formal methodology. So these are all discussions that are being held. There's also a lot of discussions about documentation, training, and other such things. If you look at the Linux Foundation in particular, they do a very good job evangelizing open source and training people to become open source contributors. So there needs to be a whole pedagogy that's assembled there. Other things on the agenda are things like mastering Cardano, things on the agenda like special purpose courses for Plutus and for core technology of Cardano. I'm going to be attending a learning conference in London in May that actually has lots of vendors who specialize in these things. And my hope is to be able to outsource a big chunk of curriculum development from our internal education division to repeatable courses for the community. So we're having a lot of discussions along those lines, and there's a litany of other little things to deal with here and there. But all things considered, a lot of progress. There's also been a lot of talk about, well, what is the Cardano Vision 2025, 2027? As many of you know, I've repeatedly said that our goal is commercial comparability, sustainability, and self-determination as kind of a goalpost for this year. Things like pipelining and input endorsers, Mithril, sidechains, these things in that bucket really get us where we need to be in that first category. In terms of sustainability, there, things like UTXO HD, a lot of the improvements we've made to the system and optimizations we've made alongside Mithril, that sustainability category we think will be fine, meaning that the network can scale to millions to billions of users and it's not going to fall in on itself. And then finally, on self-determination, really have to get to a point where not only is there a bureaucracy that is very inclusive for the community, that bureaucracy is legitimized by the voting of the community, the endowment of the community. And this is somewhat implicit, but it needs to be made explicit through Catalyst. So we're well on schedule for all of these things. It's been a colossal effort. And I'd like to thank all the people involved in it. More than 500 people across multiple organizations have had a say, internal and external. It's been just a lot. Just getting Cardano done, this concept of, what is required to really make a great impact with Basho, Voltaire, and cleaning up the remainder things in Gauguin and Shelley. It was certainly definitely a work in program and project management. And it's really impressive to see what's been done. But, rubber has to hit the road. A few other updates as well. If you want to see me in person, I will be at Consensus June 9th to 12th. I believe that's going to be held at Austin, Texas. Usually they hold it in New York, but because of COVID, I guess they moved it to Texas because it's a little easier to put on big events there. And we're going to try to have a big Cardano event there as well and bring a lot of the Cardano community, especially dApp developers, the foundations, and others. A lot more to say on our efforts with the VC side. So many of you know about the C Fund, and it's trying to take positions and help out people in the DeFi ecosystem of Cardano. We'd also like to replicate that for geography-specific funds, starting with Africa. So not much to say today, but we will certainly have more to say in the coming months on that. In terms of other updates, science is progressing pretty quickly. There's going to be a blog post imminently on pipelining, and then there's going to be a follow-up blog post in a few weeks, probably on input endorsers. I was kind of hoping to get the input endorsers blog put out in February, but it looks like that's more of a Marchy thing. But generally speaking, it'll kind of outline design principles, challenges, and why these things are interesting, and what value they have for scalability. And then some papers will come to follow. Pipelining doesn't have a paper because it's not novel from a scientific viewpoint, but input endorsers actually are. And I think they bring a lot to the story. So I believe it's real good to have the community have access to that. And this is one of those areas where it's a major leap forward in terms of scale and performance. We kind of worked our way up to it. The company wrote the parallel chains paper and then also introduced the concept of input endorsers in the original Ouroboros paper. And then if you guys are really astute about our publications, you would have noticed the Ledger Redux paper as well. So the corpus has kind of been moving and stacking and moving and stacking towards a direction, but you have to put a design on the table. And this is the first time where we've kind of pulled the threads together for a particular design that doesn't suffer from problems with DDoS attacks and so forth. It turns out it's a tricky problem, but the good news is we have a pretty good idea of that. And now it's just translating it to engineering speak for the post-fossil hard forks to roll out. So that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. Another big event that is imminent, so it's coming this month and next month, is the launch of Mamba. Now, Mamba has been in the works for years. It's the Ethereum Classic code base that we took and ported and modified, put OBFT on top of, and now are bringing to Cardano. And what Mamba is it's an introduction to the entire sidechain strategy for Cardano. So many of you know, the paper I wrote back in 2016, the Why Cardano, talked about this idea of the Cardano settlement layer and then the Cardano control or computation layer. We kind of use both terms in the documentation. But basically the idea is that the settlement layer would establish a root of trust, be very safe and very effective, and built in a way that it could easily spin up these computation layers that would have different computational and accounting models. So the biggest difference between us and Ethereum is we use extended UTXO and Plutus. Ethereum uses Solidity and EVM. It's an accounts-based model. Okay, so you can try to emulate that on the base ledger, but it adds a lot of unnecessary bloat and complexity and attack vectors. So it makes a lot more sense to run a sidechain. So for years, we've been chasing different ideas of how to operationalize that, what technological foundation should it be under. We looked a lot at the K framework, for example, and other ideas. But Mamba is really the first time, I'd say, in the project's history where we've converged to a point where we have a very crystallized viewpoint of not only how to connect the chains together, how to operate the sidechain, but then also a generic footprint that if you, the user, want to create your own sidechain, how that process works. Now, why this is so exciting for stake pool operators and people who run the sidechains is that it actually creates separate revenue streams. If you have sidechains, they can have their own tokens and tokenomics. And if you're a stake pool operator and you're operating not just Cardano, but also the sidechains, means that you'll actually get multiple tokens in your revenue stream for running your consensus node, which is real exciting if you think about it. So there's certainly a lot to come in the next 60 days about that story. And throughout the year, you kind of see this stuff roll out. Milkomeda kind of demonstrated already how a third party would do that. And then obviously the Mamba approach is a different way, and hopefully the canonical way, because it's made an abstraction so many people can follow that. Future chains will be things like, for example, the Catalyst voting network. That's around the Jormungandr code. It'll converge the same type of technology that Mamba has, and then it'll be a sidechain of Cardano and run by Cardano. And hopefully you, the community, will launch lots of these things. So look for that as well. We should have a lot more to say at Consensus about it. We'll do some presentations, and we'll have some of the people who are core parts of that team come out and kind of play around with it. Also, it means you'll be able to do hackathons in both Plutus as well as Solidity and EVM. So it's really up to you to decide what programming model makes the most sense. It's a bittersweet thing when you look at all the progress that's made and where we're at. It's bittersweet from the perspective that we're almost done with the original vision of all the things one would need for a third generation cryptocurrency. And it's a beautiful vision. It's been a long road. It's been a lot of work. You know, never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that we would have made so much progress and solved so many amazing problems. And now the next phase, when you say things like self-determination, self-governance, means that it's going to be as much you, if not more so, than it is anything I could ever come up with. So I'm excited to work with you guys in the community. I'm excited to see where these open source project structures grow. As many of you know, I'm a huge supporter of floss. We have a policy here at IO not to pursue intellectual property. We've never, despite the fact publishing 130 papers, filed for a patent. And all our software that I'm aware of is under some form of open source license. if we ever release it in a public repo. I mean, there's obviously code that we write internally, but we always end up open sourcing it at some point. So we believe in that. But it's one thing to say others can take it and do what they will. It's another thing to say, let's work with others towards a common goal and build. And that requires a different mindset, management structure, mentality. It also requires an acknowledgement that things may be a little tougher when it's just a small group of people, or you can get everybody in a room and eat a pizza with them and talk it out. You can get things done fast. But when you talk about millions of people and trying to give everybody a voice, that's a difficult one. And that's something that requires a lot of more advanced governance tools and strategies. And my view, that is the ultimate USP of Cardano. No matter how smart your founder is or capable, they all have their flaws and they all have their benefits, but no one is smarter than everyone, and no one is more capable than everyone. So the better job we do at bringing the community together and giving a solid governance and operational structure and a good bureaucracy for the open source project that is effective, the faster we can converge to brilliance. Now, there is a cost to that. The longer you invest in giving everybody a voice means the slower things come out. So there's always a balancing act between agility and speed and inclusivity and due diligence of ideas. So the good news is that we're not doing this alone. There's more than 40 years of history about distributed open source projects. In the last 20 years in particular, I'd like to believe enormous progress has been made, as demonstrated by the fact that the majority of infrastructure that we use in the world is based on open source software. And despite the fact that people are in great conflict at times with each other, there's nothing in the world that I know of that can bring the whole world together quite like open source software. So hopefully this week will give a lot of clarity. We've retained a small legion of experts. We've gotten a lot of consultants in who've done this a lot to kind of help us along. And it is really exciting to see the transformation of Cardano towards that end. And it's also exciting to see merging that with Catalyst, because you have built in all these amazing voting tools and a treasury system, which means that you have the holy grail of open source. You have a place where people feel like they have a voice. You have a place where people can actually get things done, and you have a place where funding can materialize that is truly objective and pure. A lot of institutions have to be formed moving forward, some community oriented and other ones just to counterbalance actors. Research institutions, execution institutions, standards bodies. Some will be embedded within existing, some will be blue ocean and created. And there's already a lot of work in the community in creating things like the Cardano DeFi Alliance, for example, and other alliances are coming that cover core pieces of technology in the Cardano ecosystem that, in my view, are essential for Cardano to carry out its mission of becoming the financial operating system for those who don't have one. Those alliances will be community-led and supported, of course, by us. I'm going to be cutting a lot personally grants to these different alliances, and I know the foundation has the intention to do the same. It's just a question of when and how, and the exact strategy behind that, which is one of the topics that will come up inevitably. But it's exciting, nonetheless, to see that the community is rising up and they're getting things done. You see, it's impossible to keep everybody happy. Things like protocol parameters, things like K, A naught, these things. There's great debates about what they should be at, how things should work. For example, the Curve pledge, was it SIP 007? This is an example of great, well thought out work. However, when you measure it, it looks like it does reduce the Nakamoto coefficient of Cardano. But the burden is upon the process to explain why and how, and the burden is upon the process to use these great ideas and improve them to a point where they accomplish the same thing. One of the things that we've been pushing for example, are objective metrics, because we like objectivity here. We like inclusive accountability here. It's very important to me. It's very important to the project. In particular, you will hear again and again and again that people say we need to be more decentralized. But nobody knows what decentralized means. What is it? What's the measurement? Is it like a graphics card with 3D Mark? Can you just like run a benchmark and say, okay, you're 27 and that's better than 14 or something like that? We don't have such a metric. And then there also isn't a good metric of throughput. I remember Alex Chirpinoy with Dan Friedman months ago demonstrating a transaction on Ergo that had 5,000 outputs. Simulating that transaction in an account style model like Ethereum would take many, many transactions, likely hundreds to thousands. And that's one transaction in that system. So we look at TPS and we say, oh, well, that's a metric. But if one can do thousands of transactions in one shot and the other one is very serial, TPS doesn't seem like it's a very good metric, any more so than clock speed is anymore in a processor. As a child in the 90s and 2000s, I remember the processor wars between Intel and AMD and how every week we're 1.2 gigahertz, we're 1.4 gigahertz. They'd always find a way to get the clock speed a little higher. And we as consumers were trained to think more is better. Then suddenly you had chips that were 3.4 gigahertz that were slower than chips that were 2 gigahertz. There was more to the story about these things in practice, as we've learned now with custom silicon like Apple Silicon and multi-core processors and special purpose cores for image processing and AI and so forth. Well, analogously, there's more to the story about blockchain performance. And what I'm very keen to start studying and understanding are the trade-offs. So as we move towards an open source project, people have to ask baseline questions. This change, this enhancement, this strategy, what does this ultimately do for the real world performance and throughput of the system as a whole? And what does this do with the level of decentralization for the system as a whole? Every change